It's now my pleasure to introduce Jared Blumenthal, who's the California Secretary for Environmental Protection under current Governor Gavin Newsom. So Jared, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Unfortunately, Neil, you got Jared Blumenfeld, but
I'm sorry.
He's nearly as good as Jared Blumenthal. Jared Blumenthal's like a cut above. You probably wouldn't be able to get him, but
sorry, it's written Jared
it's all good.
Blumenfeld. I just read the wrong name in my head. So
no, it's all good.
I'm sorry. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. It's always refreshing to hear Governor Brown, such conviction and kind of deep-rooted sense of thought and responsibility in his comments. Really appreciate you having him today. That was awesome. So my job, Neil and team, is to kind of lead through what we're doing right now. And first of all, to appreciate all of you. Just having this discussion, I think, is incredibly important. And we often take for granted that these things probably happen all the time, and they really don't happen enough. And to have the folks at Caltech and all the different academic institutions you have brought in is really appreciated. So I'm going to focus today on what we're doing now. Governor Brown kind of focused on some of it, but really wanted to articulate what we're doing and the approaches we're employing to meet our goals. And just to say, kind of, I think the biggest learning for us as we think about, and we can go through numbers and targets, really what the public cares about ultimately is making sure that their families are okay, making sure that their communities are going to be resilient, making sure that California is affordable. So the big frame of equity and affordability has to go hand in hand with what we're doing to reach our goals. We can't separate them out. And I think a lot of our learnings from the last 3 years has been in that area. So we're going to get into the kind of micro level detail of what our actual targets are. And hopefully you'll appreciate that. But when it comes to how we communicate, I think we've done a pretty appalling job as a movement to really explain to people what it is that everyone from California to the rest of the world is doing, what the real challenges are. We either talk about just the threats and put the fear of God in people, or we talk about just the opportunities. I think we need to really do both in combination. So California is a place, going back to the first Jerry Brown administration, like back in the 60s, Governor Reagan actually set up the Air Resources Board, set up clean air targets, because LA and where you guys are, even in Pasadena, was so polluted, you couldn't even see Mount Baldy or the mountains behind you. And obviously that problem persists today, but is literally 90% better than it was. We, as a state, are on target. We had a 2020 target to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to below 1990 levels, which we achieved 4 years early. And now we're working towards our 2030 goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions 40% below 1990 levels. And so that actually, as we think about the UN, all the countries that come out with targets, getting to 40% below 1990 by 2030 is actually incredibly difficult to achieve. And I think the main goal when we're talking to the international community about what California has been able to do in terms of its economy is our economic growth has outpaced the rest of the nation and much of the rest of the world. We're the 5th largest economy in the world. We've also, I think, from this dialogue, really been able to decouple. That decoupling of how much carbon you emit from how much GDP growth you have is kind of the most important lesson from California. There's a lot of others, but when you go to a UN conference, people want to understand how California did that. We have what's called a scoping plan, which the Air Resources Board just came out with a draft of, which is going to do 2 things. It's going to outline our path for our 2030 target, as well as achieving carbon neutrality by 2045 at the latest. none of this is as good, is only as good as the implementation. So that's the big gap, I think, both domestically and internationally, that California really, I think, exemplifies how to do right, which is implementation. Implementation takes money. And in the last budget, the 2022, we invested $15 billion of funds into our climate budget. And the governor, today's budget that we're proposing to the legislature, and hopefully they pass, is an additional $32 billion. So together, we have $47 billion for climate action, and it really represents a historic scale of investment. So I'm going to dive into a few of our, and the Governor Brown kind of referenced these, but biggest issues for us are transportation, building decarbonization, and the electricity sectors. And I'll briefly also focus on short-lived climate pollutants, because we're working with the Jet Propulsion Lab just down the street, and a lot of folks at Caltech are also involved. So let me start by focusing on our efforts to decarbonize the grid and build out renewables, specifically looking at how we then decarbonize our transportation and building sectors based on those efforts. We can't do one without the other. There's a lot of interconnectivity. So the electricity sector is currently responsible for about 15% of our state's GHG. And as you're probably aware, legislation called SB 100 requires that renewable energy and zero carbon resources supply 100% of the electricity in our retail sales by 2045. And that target is taken into account in our scoping plan, as are the projected demands on the grid from increased electrification and population growth. And according to the modeling, the state will have to add about 7 gigawatts of renewables and 2 gigawatts of storage year over year between now and 2045. So to reach the 2045 target, the state will need to more than triple its current level of in-state renewable and zero carbon power capacity. And annual build rates for the proposed scenario will need to increase 150% and over 500% for solar and battery storage, respectively, compared to historic maximum rates. So just, I mean, it's kind of dizzying. We're pointed to by the rest of the world as being able to build out that renewable capacity at a pretty fast clip, but we're going to have to increase it by 500% for battery storage and 150% for solar. So the Renewable Portfolio Standard is one of California's key programs to advancing renewable energy. The program sets continuously escalating renewable energy procurement requirements for the state's load-serving entities. And Title 20 of the Appliance Efficiency Regulations, combined with federal standards, also set minimum efficiency levels for energy and water consumption in products such as consumer, household appliances, and plumbing equipment. And I'll just pause on the last question that was asked to Governor Brown. You know, ultimately, consumers want to go into, you know, either online or into a retail establishment and just buy a piece of equipment, whether that's a TV or a hot water heater, that already helps the climate. Like, you shouldn't have to have a PhD from Caltech in order to go in and purchase equipment for your house. So standardization is incredibly important because it allows consumer to just go in and say, everything in this store is already meeting standards that are going to help save the planet, which is what every consumer assumes already. They don't think that we would be selling products today, which obviously we do, that are still contributing greenhouse gases to the planet. And so getting ahead of that. And so the analogy that I make is with, we're going to talk about building efficiency standards in a minute, but we don't talk about buildings that are capable of housing disabled Americans. We just talk about buildings because the Americans with Disability Act just made sure every building that we have is capable of serving people with disabilities. And so we need to do that same transformation with our buildings and appliances. And Title 24 of the Building Energy Efficiency Standards, which the California Energy Commission updates every 3 years, are designed to reduce wasteful and unnecessary consumption in newly constructed and existing buildings. And our approach to meeting all our targets is to combine regulatory frameworks with significant investments in incentives. As an example, the governor's proposed $10 billion in an energy package in the May revision, which just came out, including $5.2 billion to deploy a strategic energy reliability reserve to enhance grid reliability, and $1.2 billion to address past due electricity bills, and nearly $300 million to develop grid support, and then nearly $1 billion to incentivize residential solar and storage installation. Let me now switch a little bit to transportation. As you may know, California's transportation sector is the biggest source of GHG in the state, responsible for a full half of all our emissions. It's also a major cause of local air pollution that sickens low-income communities of color across our state. That's why the governor set a statewide target to reach 100% zero-emission passenger vehicle sales by 2035 and 100% emissions zero-emission truck and off-road equipment sales by 2045, making California the first state to commit to this ambitious target. And we're now working hard on regulatory programs that will set these targets into law. Already in our state, we have 1.1 million zero-emission vehicles that have been sold, making up in this last quarter 16% of all the sales in our state. By creating a clean transportation revolution, there's so much that we can and are doing to address climate change while advocating equity. California is collaborating with jurisdictions around the world to advance ZEV targets, such as the 100% sales target or phase out of gasoline, diesel, or fossil fuels. We also include automakers in the regulatory development process through partnerships, stakeholder engagement, and collaboration. Our framework is organized around creating market certainty with a light-duty zero-emission vehicle executive order currently being codified in what's called Advanced Clean Cars 2, which is a regulation, as well as innovative clean transit and advanced clean trucks. Our low NOx omnibus regulation makes sure that remaining combustion vehicles are as clean as possible. And our advanced clean fleets rule is under development to clean up priority fleets and further match supply and demand. California's low carbon fuel standard helps ensure that mobile source emissions are as low as possible and subsidizes incentive programs by requiring electricity distribution utilities to use their credits to benefit current or future electric vehicle customers. California's regulatory framework has proven to be successful. It's made a huge impact on greenhouse gas and criteria pollutant emissions, created market certainty, and provided public and environmental benefits to priority communities. The approach California takes is to pair our regulatory frameworks with significant investment in incentives. Given the importance of decarbonizing the transportation sector for meeting our carbon goals, it's no wonder that the zero-emission vehicle package is one of the biggest packages in the climate budget. It invests an additional $6.1 billion over 5 years, with a focus on communities that are most impacted, bringing the total investment to $10 billion over 6 years to decarbonize California's most polluting sectors and improve public health. The zero-emission package includes nearly $2.5 billion for zero-emission drayage trucks, transit buses, and school buses, and more than $1 billion in charging and fueling infrastructure for heavy-duty vehicles. There's also nearly $1 billion to locate charging infrastructure in low-income communities, and those investments include $400 million for port electrification, which will make a positive impact on air pollution in fence-line communities like West Oakland, Barrio Logan, and the ports of LA and Long Beach. There's over $250 million to support low-income consumer purchases of zero-emission vehicles. And the governor's also proposing $400 million for community-based transportation equity projects to increase access to clean mobility, the projects that rejuvenate walkable neighborhoods in South El Monte and connect neighborhoods by bike and transit to the waterfront in East Oakland, and enhance public transit in places like San Bernardino. Another area we're very focused on is building decarbonization. Commercial and residential buildings are responsible for about 10% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. There are about 14 million homes and over 7.5 billion square feet of existing commercial buildings in California, and fossil fuel gas currently supplies about half of the energy consumed by end users in these buildings. Each year, about 120,000 new homes and more than 100 million square feet of commercial buildings are newly constructed across our state. These buildings will represent between a third to half of the total building stock by mid-century. In the proposed scenario in the scoping plan that I discussed earlier, almost 90% of energy demand in buildings is electrified by 2045. California has several statutes and policies in place to support building decarbonization. In 2018, the California Energy Commission adopted a building efficiency code requiring most new homes to have solar systems by 2020. And in 2019, California reached the milestone of 1 million solar rooftop installations. In another piece of legislation, SB 350 set a goal to double statewide energy efficiency savings in electricity and fossil fuel gas end uses by 2030. Governor Newsom enacted 2021 budget, and our current budget, which the legislature is going to vote on soon, will also make significant investments in building decarb, including $1 billion to build sustainable, affordable housing and $700 million for the Equitable Building Decarbonization Program. Building decarbonization measures described in our scoping plan are estimated to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 14 million metric tons of CO2 by 2035 and 29 million metric tons by 2045. Finally, let me talk a little bit about short-lived climate pollutants. California is particularly focused on reducing methane and HFCs. California is a world leader when it comes to action on methane. A landmark piece of legislation, SB 1383, requires California to reduce methane emissions 40% below 2013 by 2030. So very aggressive target. As of 2019, the most recent year for which we have data, California's methane emissions had returned to 2013 levels. We're well on our way to meeting the 2030 target. And we're investing about $370 million to reduce emissions from the livestock and dairy sector, responsible for half of the state's methane emissions. This year, our law mandating 75% of organic materials be diverted from solid waste stream by 2025 went into effect, and this program will go a long way to reduce methane emissions, given that 20% of the state's methane is coming from the solid waste sector. Finally, I want to highlight a proposal that the administration is putting forward in this budget, which is $100 million for a network of satellites that would provide near real-time data on large-scale methane leaks from oil and gas infrastructure, landfills, and other sources. The satellites would be critical for California regulators to hold polluters accountable, and the rest of the world will benefit as well from transparent and timely access to where leaks are occurring anywhere on the globe. Turning to HFCs, they are the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions, in part due to increased demand for cooling and refrigeration. Since 2005, statewide HFC emissions have more than doubled. While the rate of increase has slowed in recent years due to the state's measures, HFC emissions are still on the rise in California and have grown 50% since 2010. Therefore, the adoption of low greenhouse gas refrigerants must occur in parallel to building decarbonization efforts. Without such efforts, the vast GHG benefits of the latter will be partially offset, and the proportion of emissions from refrigerants in buildings will continue to grow. Of all the HFC measures currently in place in California, they will help reduce more than 70% of current projections needed to achieve our 2030 goals. Refrigerant technology is rapidly evolving, while very low or non-greenhouse gas harming technologies and solutions are increasingly available. Not all are on cost parity with those used HFCs today, and therefore incentive programs are a key tool in accelerating the uptake of these environmentally preferable technologies. I know that a lot of ground has been covered. It's kind of been encyclopedic. I look forward to the discussion and really thank you again today for the opportunity to share with California's experience, and hopefully in the question and answer period, we can talk more about the intersectionality between climate and equity. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jared. And I think you sold yourself short before. You're definitely much better than Jared Blumenthal. So appreciate the presentation. There are a few questions here. So you talked a little bit right at the end there about the methane satellites. But more generally, sort of how do you look holistically at the whole agricultural sector in California and assess the impact that they have on global warming, and then think about mitigating that? It's sort of a very different kind of industry to try and govern than what we see on the electricity or energy side.
Yeah. So the first good news, when we're talking to agriculture, which we do a lot, all different agricultural sectors, and obviously it's a very large part of the California economy. I think the most important first thing, Neil, is to kind of not see them as other. Often it's like in the debate around drought, oh, if only those folks would do something instead of us all being in it together. So we need food. Most of us eat 3 times a day. We also really need to kind of understand what it takes to grow that food and how that system works. So on the first thing that I would say, really on the air quality side, which we've been working with agriculture for a very long time on issues of PM10 dust and issues like volatile organic compounds, ag has been a really, really incredible partner in California working on these issues. Second is kind of the vehicles used on farm. For instance, I think there are more electric ATVs that have been sold in California than the rest of the world combined. So we have incentives to get farmers out of their gas-powered ATVs that they, look at their crops on. And it's literally Polaris, the company that makes them, has had to put on more shifts just to supply them for California. The incentives get sold out. The same is true with tractor replacement programs, all the on-farm equipment. We're getting to zero emission or near zero emission as quickly as possible. And then something we didn't talk about, but is sinks for carbon. We spend a lot of time talking about engineered sinks, like direct air capture or carbon capture and storage. One of the most significant opportunities that we have is natural and working lands, and agriculture can be part of that. So grazing lands and how you sequester carbon naturally through that carbon cycle is something that we're working closely with ag on. So the final thing that we did, for instance, last year, it was set a goal of 2025 to end all agricultural burning in the San Joaquin Valley. And we now have technologies that we helped pay for through $180 million last year, which shreds on farm all those old citrus trees or vines and puts it back into the earth. So a lot of solutions happening on agriculture, and they're actually a really positive, active participant.
Great. We have another question here, very specifically goes into the electricity sector and calling out the recent and ongoing discussion, let's say, at the CPUC around net metering and of distributed energy resources. So given the need for the massive expansion of solar and renewable energy on the grid, how do we balance the issues that are being raised there and try and come to an agreement that both encourages the incorporation of distributed renewables and utility scale renewables in the fairest way possible?
Yeah, I mean, without getting into the weeds too much, basically the issue is that, the costs that have been rate-based across everyone for the folks that have put solar on their roofs disproportionately impacts low-income Californians. That's the basic issue that needed to be resolved. And I think folks are working hard to come up with solutions for doing that. The one thing that I would say, Neil, which is a huge, and maybe the Resnick Institute and others can help think through how we solve this, is just the length of time that it takes to permit anything at a utility scale, whether that's offshore wind, which the feds are now opening up on the West Coast, geothermal, or utility scale solar, or even large storage. The way that the laws are written are becoming obstacles to our pathway to get those implemented. And so a lot of people think, we have the technology, we have the money, why aren't these things getting put in place quick enough? And so we need to think about a new era of permitting within the climate emergency. How do we get this stuff online while listening and making sure we've heard from communities? Because it feels like we're getting to a place of near paralysis in the current state of permitting.
Okay. We've got one more question here. How do you implement the kinds of policies you've been talking about while also paying attention to the large cost of living here in California and the poverty divide that we're seeing, sort of building on this question around the DER, but taking it a step forward? And all of these policies have a potential to make an expensive place to live even more expensive and difficult for those on the lower income scale.
Yeah, so it's a huge issue. The governor is very focused on affordability in all that we do. So the first thing is to really recognize that there are significant cost benefits to some of these programs. So if we can help low-income Californians reduce their energy bill by home energy efficiency retrofits, by putting in heat pumps, by getting more efficient appliances. You know, I was in West Fresno recently. Their energy bill from PG&E is in a low-income community is about $900 a month. So by bringing in these technologies and prioritizing low-income Californians, we want to show the basic sweet spot, I think, for us is to be able to demonstrate to Californians, particularly low and moderate income Californians, that implementing these measures save them money. Like, they are doing something right and they don't have to be wealthy to do it. Mm-hmm. So whether that's heat pumps, which, you know, have much lower and less impactful refrigerants in them, or getting someone into a zero emission vehicle, which right now, if you stack those emissions, the governor met with the millionth Californian to get an electric vehicle. He was in Stockton, California, and stacked $23,000 of different incentives together, which can really make an electric vehicle incredibly competitive and allow someone who wouldn't normally be able to afford it to get into electric vehicles. So right now, with gasoline at $6.40 across the state, it's a great time to be in an electric vehicle. It's kind of not useful to be able to say that unless there's a real program to get folks into electric vehicles that want to, that aren't able to afford to. So the whole funding that we've done in this budget, Neil, and the real, I think, work that particularly two people, Lauren Sanchez and Ana Mata Santos, really kind of help craft this budget in a way that focuses deeply on making sure that we help low-income Californians first.
Okay. Well, great. Thank you so much, Jared. It was wonderful to have you here. I appreciate your perspectives and insight into how the state is moving forward now. And thank you again for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Neil. Take care. Good luck with the rest of the conference.
Thank you.